Thank you very much, Eric, for joining us in the Global Trailblazer podcast with Farah and myself. You are indeed a global trailblazer in the venture capital space as well as a limited partner space. And Farah, I'm just going to start off with a very basic question, and then I'm going to lead this on to you.
Sure, sure.
Uh, we first met at the Emergence 2021 event that was sponsored by wholesale investors. It was a 24-hour event. I am not sure how he was able to pull that off. It was unbelievable. It was a venture capitalist event where he had 24 hours of pictures of companies from around the world. He had yourself, myself, and several individuals. Adrian Mendoza, who I want to give a shout out to, who may be on this podcast too. And I believe that you also work with Adrian Mendoza, who I'm
Yep.
extremely proud of. But throughout that podcast, I kept asking myself, what was the story? What was your journey like, Eric, in terms of going into the venture capital space? Share with the audience your journey as to how you got into this space, why you're in this space, and what was the reflection points throughout your journey. So if you can share with us what is the motivating factors that brought you in the venture capital space?
Sure, happy to talk about that. So I've been in the startup and corporate innovation space my entire career. I was employee number one at a startup when I went to university, actually, in Virginia. I went to the College of William and Mary back in the early 90s. And while I was in college, I saw a flyer for a startup job as the first employee to do all manners of things, including operations and sales and marketing. And it was, I see myself going through different eras, right? And this was during the era of the PC, when you could actually build PCs from different components, when you had the rise of Dell and some other, a lot of other computer manufacturers. And the founder started a company to sell built computers and sell those PCs to college and university students, because everybody at that point needed a PC. So I saw the flyer. It was a hot late summer day in Virginia, and I hopped on the only transportation I had was my old beaten up bike. I put on a suit and I cycled 10 miles to the interview, and it was about 100-degree day. So I arrived hot and sweaty and went into the interview with the founder. And first thing he told me was, "Hey, you look like you need a beer." So anyway, we hit it off, and I joined the company, and that was my first startup job. So I really loved it. I worked there for about 2.5 years, and we became best friends. We're still best friends to this day, and we see each other during normal times, non-COVID times, about once or twice a year. So I really fell in love with building things at that point. But for a number of reasons, including family, I decided at that point to leave the company after 2.5 years and to work at a corporate gig doing software engineering at what's today Verizon, which is a large telco here in the States. And did that for a few years. And at that point, got some experience in large corporate space doing software engineering, but decided I wanted to go back into the startup world. And at that point, in the mid 90s and late 90s, it was kind of the rise of the internet agencies, right? And I joined an internet agency called New Media Publishing at that point in Washington, D.C. And about 3 months later, shipped over to Amsterdam to open their European office. So I ended up in Amsterdam for a few years, helping them to scale the business there. We worked with a lot of corporates as well as NGOs, including the World Wildlife Fund, Greenpeace, and other governmental organizations, which was really meaningful work that we did. We actually built a system for the World Wildlife Fund that was the precursor to blogging. So imagine the World Wildlife Fund people and advocates in the field in Africa and Asia being able to blog with their constituents. So that was interesting work, really meaningful, and I really enjoyed it. And while I was there at NMP, we were acquired. We were rolled up of about 7 companies. And then subsequent to that, went public with a company called Commerce One. Subsequent to going public, I ran into another company called Nervewire, which is Boston-based, but needed to open a Dutch office or European office. So I went to Norway and helped them to open up the office there. And about a year later, the first internet crash happened, and we decided to close the European office. And I ended up at HQ here in Boston for Nervewire. So really enjoyed that. It was a great company, a DNA of management consultancy, strategy consultants, and also some startup founders as well. And we really, the methodology we applied with our clients was in some ways the precursor to design thinking, right? Where you had multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary thinking about design, business, and technology. Helping them innovate. And we worked with startups as well as corporate innovators at that point. So that's kind of the start of my career. Subsequent to that, I've been worked at additional innovation agencies, including Frog Design. I led global services for a tech company called Brightcove, which is an online video provider, and led the global services team there. Worked for a number of other startups. And then a few years ago, I was CEO of a digital marketing SaaS company and helped to scale that and exited it in 2018. And at that point, because of personal reasons too, my daughter turned 5, she started kindergarten. I wanted to spend more time at home. I said, look, instead of having a single job, right, I would take more of a portfolio approach to what I'm doing. So that's really my life right now, kind of bucketed into 3 different areas. So the first area is giving back to the community. I mentor at several accelerators, including Techstars, Mass Challenge, also for a VC called a number of VCs as well. I'm also on the board of directors for an organization called Venture Capital. We provide venture capital training to minorities and women. We just finished up the cohort for the summer, and subsequent to that, the fellows are placed at venture capital firms, entry-level positions. I'm also on the board of advisors for the Capital Network. We provide fundraising training to founders, but also specifically to women and minorities. And we have a 6-month program running right now as well for that. The second bucket is advising and consulting with startups and scale-ups, primarily pre-seed, seed stage companies, some scale-ups as well. I focus on product, customer success, strategy, and operations. And then in parallel to that, also have a consultancy with a partner of mine in the AI and data science space. And same thing there, we provide services to startups and then also large corporates and venture capital firms as well. We do a lot of work around natural language processing and computer vision. And then kind of going back to your original question, Ken, is around the investing side. That's the third bucket, right? So I'm an LP in 2 funds, Mendoza Ventures, which you mentioned a few minutes ago. We invest in fintech, in AI, and cyber security. It's a smaller fund, but very much focused on companies that we have a fairly long due diligence process, but really make sure that's a fit there, not just from the money perspective, but also from a strategic perspective in terms of the human capital that we can provide to our companies. The second,
also be that criteria for diversity, equity, inclusion.
Exactly.
He's one of the few Hispanic VCs on the Northeast Coast. I mean, he is really one of the few. I mean, I've done my research as to trying to find as any, and I speak to Adrian frequently, and wow, you are truly one of the few in this space. I mean, he's, to me, not only is he a trailblazer, but he's also legendary.
Exactly, right.
So you're doing a lot of great things.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the first Latino fund on in the Northeast, and Adrian is of Mexican descent, and then the other GP is his wife, right? So it's minority and women-owned and founded, and roughly about 68% of the investments are with companies that have minorities or immigrants or women as founders as well. So it's a great fund. Would suggest anybody who's interested in becoming an LP definitely look at it. And then the second fund is AI Capital. So we invest in later stage, usually applied AI companies. And then also an angel investor with several groups, a Launchpad Venture Group, which is a group here in Boston, about 150 members. One of the older groups around roughly 20 years right now. And it was really one of the first groups to be established to professionalize angel investing. And then TBD Angels, which is kind of the other side of the spectrum. It's fairly new, just over a year old. about 165 members right now, and still mostly operators, and by design, very diverse as well, and very tech focused in terms of how we do deal flow, how we evaluate companies as well. So that's it's kind of what I'm doing these days.
No, that's amazing. I mean, when I look at your journey, it goes back into your original start of marketing, sales. You got a bit of design thinking in there, and you still got that entrepreneurial spirit, and it shows in those three buckets that you mentioned. And it's quite amazing that you're touching community services, that you also go into as a limited partner, but you also take the time to actually advise startups in trying to build their operations. So you understand that business life cycle that a lot of the startups are really trying to gather and try to understand. So that's really commendable, Erik. I look at your history; it's beautiful. It's a beautiful journey. It's what's needed in the industry. Farah, you have any questions, Farah? I'm going to leave you with some questions for Erik.
Lots of questions for Erik. Yeah, because it's so interesting that you're helping women and minorities, and I also happen to be in this venture capital space. I've been like an entrepreneur myself, trying to build my startup sometimes, and then I went to become a GP. Had quite a challenging time to raise capital for the fund. But now I'm actually still having some partners. But I saw this 24 number of companies, and I'm so impressed. And so I would like to know if you could share with us your challenges in fundraising and how you overcame it, and how do you structure your fund, and how do you optimize them?
Yeah, so in terms of fundraising for I think it's whether you're fundraising as a founder, as a startup, or a GP, right? I think the process is fairly similar. I think sometimes the startup founders forget that if they're pitching to a venture capitalist, you kind as a VC, you kind of have both sides, right? You have to raise money, and then you have to deploy that money as well. So it's you're in a way you're a startup yourself, right? So I think the fundraising process is very similar. What I tell founders is always fundraising is just like sales, right? You have, just like you're doing customer development, you have to do investor development as well. Build your pipeline, right? And then through that pipeline, find the right fit, qualify your potential investors, whether they're LPs or angels, and then really qualify them, make sure that they're the right investors, not just by writing a check, but also strategically, that they can provide the right network, potentially the right strategic advice as well, and that they're a cultural fit, right? There's going to be chemistry with your investors as well. I think sometimes you will take money from those investors that just write a check, but you do definitely want to be biased towards finding those investors that can provide a lot more value than just money itself. I think, for me, it's, if you look at the venture capital industry and the startup and tech industry, we still have a problem, right, in terms of representation and money going to women and minorities and immigrants as well. And I really doubled down last year and the year before when everything was happening. And there's been a lot of talk, right, in the industry about we need more diversity, we need more money flowing towards women and minorities and so on. And I kind of bucketed that into two areas, right? One is, I think, people who are only talking about it, right, but not taking action, and those who are actually talking about it and taking action with intent, right? And for me, it was this journey. I have a 7-year-old daughter, and for my main mission in life is making sure that I leave the world a better place, right, than I found it, for her. And then I really said, look, last year, what I'm going to do is to really focus my efforts on helping women and minorities, both on the venture capital side and the startup side as well, and really focus on that and take action. And I think it's really important for me, and I think for me as a white male, to do that, right? And to be an ally and an advocate as well, and to raise my voice about it and to take action, to put my money there and my skills, my experience as well. So that's why I'm involved with both the funds that I'm involved with as an LP and the angel investments that I'm making, as well as the organizations that I'm involved in at Venture Capital and the Capital Network as well.
So wonderful thing that you're doing there, Erik, is awesome. And in terms of when you're looking at an investment term sheet, what are the most important clauses that you would focus on, and what advice would you part with the GPs in this instance?
Yeah, I think that there's obviously a number of different terms that are important from an economical perspective, right? Longer term in terms of rights, in terms of follow-on, in terms of liquidation rights and so on. I think those are all important. But what I find is whether you're a GP or an angel investor, valuation, right? A lot of times it's the part that you really need to agree on. And you can, in a sense, you can agree on any type of, you can agree on a valuation that seems really good for the founder, right? And they might be happy, but you can work on the term sheet to make sure that in the end, that valuation doesn't mean a lot, right? You can get, as a founder, can even get diluted, right? So you have to be careful both in terms of the terms that are there, and then also the valuation itself. And some of the groups that I'm involved in, we really focus on both, hey, do you have the right terms that are friendly to the founder and the investor? And then is the valuation correct as well? I mean, with Launchpad Venture Group, for instance, we'll walk, right, if the valuation is too high, because we want to make sure that the founders are positioned well for follow-on rounds and don't have the risk of a down run in the end. And it's a little different for us as well, because we're based in Boston for this particular group, and we only invest in Boston and Northeast-based companies. So valuations tend to be a little less than, let's say, out west, where it's very frothy right now, right? We don't see these super seed rounds. But again, I think it's holistically looking at all the terms and the price of the company and who the investors are on the cap table as well. That's important for us. So we take a look at a really broad picture of how we make those investments.
Yeah, thank
Erik,
you.
that's a good point, Erik, in terms of valuations being very regional. I didn't actually think about that, because one of the things that I talk about frequently is doing a global syndication. So I like the idea that you actually are doing the angel investing in that Boston Northeast area. And those valuations are completely different than what's happening in California and what's happening in Australia, what's happening in Europe and so forth. My question to you, which is really, what spur you on to doing a syndicate? Because I think one of the biggest opportunities for venture capitalists is the ability to go in and look at different deal flows, to come up with a valuation kind of schedule or strategy, and to go in and invest together. And it helps founders out to a large degree. It gets some funding a lot faster, particularly diversity, equity, inclusion. Because one of the key areas that I see among diversity, equity, inclusion founders and VCs is the inability to come together and to share ideas and share information. You and I, we spend a lot of time talking about deal flows and so forth. What caused you to actually in Boston come together and say, hey, we need to look at from an angel, you mentioned pre-seed and seed level, but also you are coming together, you're looking at different deal flows, you come up with different terms and agreements. And it's kind of sounding like you guys are syndicating together. How did you get to that point of doing that in your investment life cycle?
Yeah, it depends on the organization, right? So I'll talk about syndication and kind of the access to capital in two parts, right? One is, and give you an example with Launchpad Venture Group, excuse me, where we only do seed stage price deals, right? And when we do, we always take the lead with the companies that we invest in. But we can't, as a group, necessarily fill that entire amount of the round. So, for example, we work with a company that I'm invested in as well, and I'm an advisor on, called Real Play Sports. We provide youth baseball and softball video to players, parents, and coaches, right, via a SaaS platform. Cool, fun company, right? Really has a good product market fit right now. But we invested as Launchpad Venture Group, but the investment was about roughly $750,000 for the seed stage. But we have 150 members. We always say if we have 25 members who are interested in a deal, that's really good, right? Out of those 150. And we kind of joke around that the 25 members think it's a great deal, and the 125 think those 25 are crazy, right? So, but that just goes to show that angel investors specifically have a very wide range of interests, right? And that's just natural, right? As opposed to a VC firm that has a very specific thesis. You have, angels are interested not just in the companies themselves, but also potentially the mission of the company. They're also interested in various different sectors based on their background experience. It's their money that they're investing, right? So, but going back to the syndicate side, we can't necessarily fill that. So we have relationships with other angel groups where we syndicate out those deals and then they may invest together as well. So with Real Play Sports, for instance, we have a number of different angel groups across the nation who are invested in the company itself. So that helps the founders and that helps access to capital as well, and just goes to show the strength of the network, right, that we have. I think on the other side, what you're seeing is really the acceptance of crowdfunding. It's not the rise of crowdfunding. Crowdfunding has been around for a while, right? But I think acceptance in crowdfunding and people really seeing that this really increases the access to capital and access to new investors as well. And just look at Republic, for instance, right? Republic has done really well, and with Backstage Capital raising 2 times already on Republic and really quickly filling the round. And Backstage Capital is a venture capital firm, right?
She did the 1 million, and then she followed up with a 5 million, right? So she timed it right.
Yeah.
After she did that 1 million, she came around and said, "There's room for another 4 million." So you're absolutely right. Yes.
Yeah, and you know, I think that is a really good thing because it provides more access to capital. It also provides access to investing for a group of investors that would have never been able to invest before. Plus, it provides more capital to companies that might not have been able to get capital through traditional channels as well. Right. So I think we're really seeing that. I think that's a really good thing. And the acceptance of that's, we're seeing companies sometimes raising in parallel paths, right? They're raising through angels or VCs, and they're raising on crowdfunding sites as well. And I think in general, that's a good thing, right? And we'll see more. There's a lot of capital out there, right? It's a question of how do you access that capital?
Exactly. A follow-up question here. And that's great that crowdfunding, the Jobs Act is actually it's being deployed, it's being used. You see more Reg A, Reg A pluses, Reg CFs, Reg D. I'm not sure about the Reg D. That's a little cloudy at the moment. But follow up to that question, and I hear this frequently in the industry, and this is among early VCs in terms of trying to get board rights. You know, how significant is that for that venture capitalist to be on the board? And one, I mean, this is a 2-part question. Is it very important for them to be on the board? And 2, do they actually have enough to be board qualified? Because I heard this conversation. I'm not going to say who in this industry, well-recognized person. In fact, you and I know this, and they were emphasizing being on the board. And I kind of made the comment to this individual, you don't have enough capital injected to be even board qualified to even have that conversation. And I was really looking at in terms of the ownership rights of the founder. That's really what I was keen at and targeting at, is that ownership rights of the founder. But how significant is it for VCs to target in terms of being on the board? And is that something that you deal with and have dealt with before in terms of your investment portfolio? Farah mentioned that there's 24 companies. Do you find yourself wanting to be more on board, or is that something that you don't even look at and you're just focusing mainly on the valuation and so forth?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of investor and the amount of investment you're making, right? If you're a venture capital firm and you're the lead investor and you let's say take 20% of the company, I think you should have a right to have a board seat, right? And I think that's good, right, for both parties. Even just founding a board for or having a board for founders, I think from the early stages, right? And once you're kind of at the seed stage, it's really important, right? Because you need to surround yourself with advisors and board members who can help guide you, right? So I think there's an inherent right, if you're a lead investor and have a certain percentage of the company, that you should have a board seat. I think it's good in general for governance. But if you're a smaller investor, right, if you don't have a significant share of the company, right, I mean, you certainly don't necessarily have that right? We just went through a fundraise with another company that I'm advising, and we're raising $1 million. $500,000, $500,000 of that came in from a lead VC. And they're not getting a board seat, but they're getting an observer seat, right? So they're board observer at this point. And then eventually, if they do a follow-on, they might get a full board seat. So we thought that was a fair compromise. What we do, let's say, switch over to the angel side with Launchpad Venture Group. If we're a lead investor, we typically get a board seat there as well. And again, we think it is beneficial, right? Governance needs to be there. I've seen some companies and startups that don't have a well-qualified, strong board, and they might have friends on the board seat, right? But that's not good, because you as a founder need to surround yourself with people who can fill in your blind spots and to be honest with you, right? And have the fiduciary duty as well to make sure there's a strong governance in place and the companies are run well.
Yeah, that's excellent. Farah, I'm going to lead it off with you with the last question.
Right. My last question would be, of all the companies that you are sitting on board and involved with, which are the ones they perform better in the sector performance, and which are your favorites?
It's hard to pick favorites among all the children, because that's what I always say. A lot of companies, all the companies I'm working with, I really like, and I've a lot of hope for. I'll just maybe just name a few in terms of why I really like them, and I'm very founder focused, right? Because I do focus on early stage. It's about founders for me a lot of times. Yeah, obviously the market has to be there. You've got to eventually have the product market fit, but first thing I do take a look at is the founding team, and or is the founder coachable, right? Do they know the industry well? I love founders who are in some ways scratching their own itch. So for instance, one of the companies that I'm working with right now, advising, and I mentioned the investment that they got. We're raising $1 million round. It's called Focal Point, all right? And Focal Point is a B2B SaaS solution. The founder's based in Atlanta. It's in procurement, and procurement specifically to solving a problem called category management. And the founder has been in the procurement space, a procurement exec for more than 25 years. He knows the space inside and out. He's been in major global corporations running procurement, right, for billions of dollars of spend. And guess what? That spend is managed by spreadsheets and PowerPoints, right? So last year, just a month before the pandemic, he decided, look, I'm going to build a company and build a product that actually solves this problem for large enterprises. And a year later, less than a year later, 9 months later, in January, he launched the product, brought it to market, and he already has 5 marquee clients on board right now. And he's scaling fast, and he's absolutely dedicated to this. And again, he's scratching his own itch. He knows procurement. He's got a lot of relationships. He's building an amazing product, amazing company, and that's the type of investment and the type of company that I love, right? So, and by the way, it's a company that's also, Atlanta's a hotspot right now for startups, but it's also not in one of the major hotspots. You think about Silicon Valley, Boston, and so on, right? So. I like the fact that it's in somewhat of a secondary, I don't want to call Atlanta a secondary city, right? But it's not the usual spot, right? So yeah, but that's, and there are a number of other companies in the portfolio that are very similar as well that I have high hopes for.
Can I be greedy here, Erik, just for a moment? In terms of the industries, because you mentioned Atlanta, and I look at, most people look at Boston, New York, Silicon Valley here in the U.S., and Toronto. It's actually, to me, Toronto was a nice place for fintech and regtech. Vancouver. I got lucky many years ago with Australia. That was really a bit surprise for me. I didn't realize about 3 or 4 years ago, I was actually I was sourcing for a couple of funds based in Taiwan as well as in Australia, and they exposed me to the Australian market. And part of that was the back off operations for a lot of the Chinese firms. So there was a lot of technology that was done on the second and third level of operations out there. But in terms of industries, what industries do you see as, from an investor standpoint, industries that VC should look at, as well as in terms of cities? Because you mentioned Atlanta is an upgrowing city. It's not a major city yet, but it still have a lot of talent there in terms of technology and innovation. So in terms of a VC, what industries are you looking at? And in terms of what cities would you look at in terms of finding companies in the future, and also other VCs that you as an LP want to invest in, or for VCs like Farah and myself, we may want to look for LPs, and we may be looking in the wrong cities and in the wrong places. So there's really three questions. Those three questions is in terms of the actual cities that you see that's growing in innovation technology, in terms of where do you see the industry going at, and in terms of VCs, what should VCs look for in LPs in their geographies?
Yeah, so maybe start off with the cities, right? So thinking about North America, U.S., Canada, right? I think there's a lot of innovation happening in Austin. It's a big hotspot. A lot of people moving there. Interesting enough, a lot because of COVID-19, there's also a big migration down to Miami and Florida itself. I think that's going to become a tech hotspot. Pittsburgh has a lot of innovation around, especially AI and self-driving tech and so on. That's a city that people tend to not talk about a lot, but that has a lot of innovation going on. You're seeing cities like Nashville, for instance, attracting a lot of tech talent as well. Even Cleveland and Cincinnati, right? The kind of the middle of the country, right, is attracting more and more interest as well from investors and from tech as well. Especially because of the pandemic, people can move anywhere, right? And I think money's going into secondary and tertiary locations, and the tech talent is moving there as well. Canada, you mentioned Toronto. Obviously, there's Vancouver. I think is big as well, and Montreal. Right, they all have their expertise and hotspots. I think internationally, you mentioned Australia. There's a lot going on there as well, right? I'm working with a low-code, no-code platform right now that's based in Australia, and I think one thing you do have a more segmented market, less access to capital, but I think the access to capital is increasing because the money is becoming more global, right? So take a look at Canva, for instance, right, which is based in Australia. They don't just have Australian investors, they've got US investors as well, and investors from Europe. So I think that the capital is becoming more global as well for a lot of investors. In terms of sectors, for me personally, e-commerce, I think is again, the pandemic has just accelerated the move towards e-commerce. There's a lot of innovation, a lot of opportunity along the entire supply chain of e-commerce, not just the endpoints of actually purchasing, but also throughout the supply chain. And I think we're just at the early stages of e-commerce right now. Fintech, a lot of innovation happening there, right? In some ways, disintermediation, in some ways of the different solutions that are out there. And then I think in general, companies that are solving the bigger long-term issues, right, around climate change as well, environment, right, population, smart cities as well. I think those are, from an investor, you've got to be a certain type of investor to invest in those because those are the long game. But I think long-term, those are the companies that will make the biggest difference for us as a society. And the third question was around LPs, right? About what to look for in LPs.
Most important.
Yeah, if you may.
Golden goose. What do you find the golden goose for LPs?
Yeah, I think just as an LP myself, I think and I think I'll give the same answer as I do to startup founders in terms of looking for money, right? I think find LPs that have some LPs write just a check, right? And that's it. And that's their model. Other LPs can be very involved. It also depends on your fund itself, right? So for instance, with Mendoza Ventures is really building a community of LPs who are highly engaged with their community, with other LPs, with the GPs, and with the portfolio companies as well. So, some of the LPs are actually advisors to those companies, not just advising in terms of bringing the network, in terms of bringing their expertise as well. And sometimes you see, whether it's Mendoza Ventures or other funds, sometimes LPs even become employees of those companies, right? If there's a good fit in terms of skill level and expertise and chemistry as well. So if you're a GP looking to raise funding, I would say definitely find investors and LPs who are aligned with your mission and with your thesis, whether it's thematic or otherwise, and who can also provide something more than just a check. They can provide expertise, mentorship, advice, and then their network as well. So hopefully, if you get an LP on board, they can introduce you to 3 other potential candidate LPs as well, who might become investors in your fund.
Okay, that's a really good answer. Thank you so much, Erik, for that guidance. Truly appreciate it. Yeah, I think we have come to the end of the podcast, and we would like to thank Erik for your time and insights to this podcast. And we look forward to collaborate further on future potential deals. And over to you, Ken, if you want to say any few words.
Yeah. Well, Eric, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your journey. As Farah and I mentioned earlier, you are truly a global trailblazer. You define what it is. This is one of the reasons why we actually did this podcast is to one, to meet with limited partners and VCs such as yourself, but also to share this knowledge base across the community, not just here in the US, but globally. So our podcast is also it's being aired in Asia and Europe and other places around the world. So they're having access to your journey and your experiences, and that's very critical. One of the key areas that touch at home is that diversity, equity, inclusion. Being in this space myself for quite some time, there's a saying that there's a lot of talk, but there's very few walk. And one of the things that Farron and I has really concentrated on is trying to get speakers and industry experts who are really living up to these standards and criterias, and you do it by far. In fact, our next guest will more than likely be women. We'll probably follow with a couple of women in our next guest, a couple of women VCs. But we want to thank you so much, Erik, for taking the time today, and we definitely looking forward to having you. And most importantly, how can how can founders as well as other VCs reach out to you? Is that something that is there any means of reaching out to you, Erik, via social media or?
Yeah, I would say social media. LinkedIn is the best way to reach out to me. If you do connect on LinkedIn or reach out to me, definitely please provide some context. I get there's a lot of spam out there, so just help me help you, right? Add some context in terms of why you're reaching out. I'm not much of a social media tweeter. I'm on there on occasion, but most likely, maybe once a week. Same thing with Facebook and Instagram. I'd rather spend time in the real world. So yeah, LinkedIn is the best way, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you so
But
much.
Thank you so much, Erik. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Farah and Ken. Thanks for having me.
Right. Thank you.